Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are getting into a diagnostic challenge that every single psychiatrist, you included, is going to face. Telling the difference between bipolar and unipolar depression. Look, getting this call right is a huge deal for your patient's treatment and their outcome. And you know, the evidence here has changed a lot in just the last couple of decades.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll kick things off with that core clinical problem. Then we'll dive into this really interesting probabilistic approach. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of what's called the bipolar depressive signature. We'll look at the hard evidence that backs all this up, and then we'll peek into what the future of diagnosis might hold.
All right, let's get right into it. We're starting with a question that honestly changes everything for any patient who walks in with depression.
So, your patient is sitting in front of you. They're in a major depressive episode. The big question is this unipolar depression or is it the depressive side of a bipolar illness? And let's be real, this gets incredibly tricky when you don't have a clear history of mania or hypomania to go on. Making the wrong call here isn't just a small mistake. It can lead to treatments that don't work, or worse, actually make the patient's condition more unstable. Think about what happens with antidepressant monotherapy in unrecognized bipolar disorder.
You know, it is kind of wild to think about now, but back around the year 2000, a lot of very respected people in our field were saying things just like this. The thinking was, hey, depression is depression. This quote, it just goes to show you how radically our understanding has shifted in a relatively short amount of time.
So what was the turning point? Well, a huge part of the change came from the International Society for Bipolar Disorders, the ISBD. They put together a task force that completely reframed how we should think about this diagnostic puzzle.
What the ISBD task force figured out was this. There's no single silver bullet symptom. No one thing that's pathognomic, a smoking gun that screams bipolar depression. Instead, it's all about the pattern. It's about looking at a whole constellation of clinical features that, when you put them all together, create a really high probability of one diagnosis over the other. It's like being a detective, building a case from the evidence.
And they didn't just pull this out of thin air. Their process was incredibly thorough. They brought in experts from all over the world. They did a deep dive into all the existing research to find the features that kept popping up over and over again. And from that, they came up with clear, practical criteria to help clinicians like you with the big goal of influencing the next versions of the DSM and the ICD.
Okay, so what is this bipolar depressive signature? Let's get right into the nuts and bolts, because this is the heart of it all. This is the tool that you can take and start using in your clinic tomorrow. So here's the rule of thumb from the ISBD. If your patient has 5 or more of these features, a bipolar diagnosis should be very high on your differential. And notice what's on this list. We're talking about those classic atypical depressive features, right? Hypersomnia, hyperphagia. Then there's leaden paralysis, that feeling like their arms and legs are made of lead. And also significant psychomotor retardation, a really early start to their illness, like under 25. And of course, that all-important positive family history for bipolar disorder.
On the flip side, we have the clues for unipolar depression. If you see 4 or more of these, you should be leaning in that direction. And it really is almost a mirror image of the bipolar list, isn't it? Here you see the more classic melancholic stuff. Trouble falling asleep, losing weight and appetite, lots of physical or somatic complaints, and a later onset of illness.
Okay, but it gets even more detailed. Later research has helped us see the differences within bipolar disorder itself. What we've learned is that bipolar 1 depression, that's where you're more likely to see the really profound psychomotor retardation and psychotic features. Bipolar 2 depression, though, that has its own unique flavor. It's often marked by prominent mixed features. So you've got this depression, but it's mixed with agitation, irritability, and racing thoughts. That's a huge clue for BP2.
But look, a model is just a model, right? The real question is, does this thing actually work out in the real world in the clinic? Well, let's take a look at the evidence that really validates this whole approach. So a major validation study back in 2011 from Mitchell's group put this model to the test. And what they found was a positive predictive value of up to 82%. So let's translate that. It means if your patient checks off those boxes for bipolar depression using this framework, there's an 82% chance you've got the diagnosis right. That's a much more solid, evidence-based foundation to stand on than just clinical gut feeling, right? And this isn't just something that works in, say, North America or Europe. A huge study came out of China in 2019. We're talking almost 1,500 patients. And it found many of the exact same distinguishing features. This is a really big deal because it suggests this bipolar depressive signature is a universal thing. It crosses cultural and ethnic lines.
Okay, but for me, this next piece of evidence is maybe the most powerful of all. There was a longitudinal study that followed young people between 12 and 30 years old who were already at high genetic risk for bipolar disorder. And what it found was incredible. If those kids had a depressive episode with 4 or more of these bipolar features, their risk of eventually converting to a full bipolar 1 or 2 diagnosis shot up 7 times. 7-fold. That tells us this signature can show up before the first full-blown mania or hypomania, which makes it a critical early warning sign.
All right, the clinical evidence is pretty solid, you have to admit. But that's not the end of the story. So let's look forward a bit to where the science is trying to take us. The next frontier is all about bringing objective, biological data into the picture.
Yeah, the big push right now is to find reliable biomarkers. We're seeing some really interesting stuff in neuroimaging, things like differences in white matter tracks and in the connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Now, the findings aren't always consistent, I have to say, but when you feed this imaging data into machine learning models, they're getting pretty good at telling the two conditions apart. And then you've got things you can measure in the blood, like specific microRNAs or lower levels of BDNF gene expression. So the potential is definitely there. But, and this is a big but, none of this is ready for prime time in your clinic. Not yet, but this is where we're headed, towards a future more objective diagnosis.
So when you pile up all this evidence, both the clinical signs and these emerging biomarkers, it really starts to look like a powerful argument against our current diagnostic manuals. This quote says it all, doesn't it? The fact that systems like the DSM and ICD don't really acknowledge these dimensional differences, well, that's a huge reason why the diagnosis of bipolar disorder gets missed so often.
And that's why the authors we're drawing from make a really strong case here. They're basically saying that future editions of the DSM and ICD, they have to include this evidence. It's not optional anymore. Even if the differences are on a spectrum, dimensional rather than a simple yes or no box, they are just too important for making an accurate diagnosis and choosing the right treatment. We just can't afford to ignore them.
So that brings us to the final and maybe most important question. And this one's for you. Now that you have this evidence-based, probabilistic framework in your back pocket, how is that going to change the way you assess the very next patient who walks into your office with depression? Because the clues, they're there. You just have to know what you're looking for.